I still remember the exact moment. I realized something was changing between my son and us. It happened 3 months before the wedding, when my wife Helen stood in our kitchen, carefully opening the invitation envelope like it contained something sacred. She had tears in her eyes before she even unfolded the card. Our son Daniel was finally getting married. For weeks, she talked about nothing else. She planned dresses, practiced hairstyles, and kept showing me old photographs of Daniel as a little boy wearing toy bow ties and pretending to dance with her in the living room. But the excitement slowly started turning into confusion. The wedding planner never called Helen. The bride, Vanessa, barely responded to her messages. Every suggestion my wife made was politely ignored. At first, Helen blamed herself. "Maybe I'm being too involved," she kept saying. But I knew better. I noticed the tone Vanessa used whenever she spoke to Helen. Smiles that looked forced. Compliments that sounded like insults. The kind of attitude wealthy people sometimes use when they think they're better than everyone else. And Vanessa came from money. Serious money. Her father owned several luxury car dealerships across California, and their family acted like royalty every time we met them. Meanwhile, Helen and I lived a simple life in Ohio. I spent 40 years building a construction company from nothing. Not glamorous, not flashy, just honest work. We weren't poor, but we didn't walk around bragging about designer brands or country clubs either. Vanessa's family did. Constantly. One evening, Daniel came over alone, looking nervous. He sat at our dining table, rubbing his hands together before finally speaking. "Dad, Vanessa thinks maybe Mom should wear something a little more modern to the wedding." Helen froze. I saw her face drop instantly, even though she tried to smile through it. "Modern?" she asked softly. Daniel avoided eye contact. "She just means less conservative." That was the first crack. But it didn't stop there. A week later, Vanessa changed a mother-son dance song without telling Helen, even though it was a song Daniel used to sing with her as a child. Then she removed several family traditions because they were too middle class. Every little thing chipped away at my wife's happiness. Yet Helen kept trying. She spent hours finding the perfect dress, terrified of embarrassing Daniel somehow. One night, I walked into our bedroom and found her staring at herself in the mirror with tears rolling down her face. "Do I really look old-fashioned?" she whispered. That question broke something inside me, because no husband wants to see the woman who sacrificed her entire life for her family suddenly feeling ashamed of herself. The truth is, Helen deserved that wedding more than anyone. When Daniel was 10 years old, I nearly lost my business during the recession. We almost lost our home. Helen worked double shifts at a hospital for years, so Daniel could stay in private school. She sold jewelry her mother left her just to help pay for Daniel's college books. She never complained once. Not once. Every achievement Daniel ever had came from her sacrifices. And now this young woman was treating her like some embarrassing relative who should sit quietly in the corner. I wanted to confront Daniel immediately, but Helen begged me not to. "It's their special day," she said. "I don't want drama." So I stayed quiet. For her. Then came the rehearsal dinner. That was the night I realized Vanessa's disrespect wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Helen walked into the restaurant wearing a navy blue dress she had spent weeks choosing. She looked beautiful, elegant, classy. But before we even sat down, Vanessa looked her up and down and laughed quietly with her bridesmaids. I caught it. Helen caught it too. During dinner, Vanessa introduced her own mother to everyone as a woman with flawless taste, then glanced toward Helen and added, "And some people still prefer vintage styles." The table laughed awkwardly. My wife pretended not to notice while squeezing her napkin under the table, so tightly her knuckles turned white. That's when I started paying attention to everything. The seating arrangements, the whispered comments, the way Vanessa kept excluding Helen from photos and conversations. It was all intentional. She wanted my wife to feel small. But what nobody at that wedding knew was who had actually paid for nearly all of it. Not Vanessa's rich father. Not Daniel. Me. And I hadn't told a single person yet. The strange thing about wealthy people is that they often assume everyone else is struggling. Vanessa's family saw our modest home, our quiet lifestyle, and my old pickup truck, and immediately decided we were beneath them. They never asked questions, never cared enough to learn who we really were. To them, I was just Daniel's quiet father who wore simple suits and avoided attention. They had no idea I sold my construction company 5 years earlier for more money than Vanessa's father had probably ever imagined. I never liked showing off wealth. Helen didn't either. After decades of hard work, we wanted peace, not attention. So we stayed in our same house, drove practical cars, and lived quietly. Daniel knew the truth, of course, but he grew up learning not to talk about money. Apparently, he forgot that lesson once Vanessa entered his life. 2 months before the wedding, Daniel came to see me privately. He looked exhausted. "Dad," he said, "Vanessa's parents are helping with some expenses, but the wedding is becoming bigger than expected." Bigger was an understatement. This wasn't a wedding anymore. It was a Hollywood production, a luxury vineyard in Napa Valley, crystal chandeliers imported from Italy, a celebrity chef, a live orchestra, designer flower walls taller than our living room ceiling. Every week, Vanessa added something new. Daniel admitted they were drowning financially trying to keep up with her vision. I asked him one simple question. "Are you asking me for help?" He looked embarrassed, even saying yes. Helen overheard the conversation later that night and immediately said we should help. That's who she is. Even after all the disrespect, her first thought was protecting Daniel from starting married life buried in debt. I told Daniel I would handle it quietly. No loans, no conditions. Just one request. Don't tell Vanessa or her parents the full amount came from me. At first, he looked confused. "Why keep it secret?" he asked. I'll never forget my answer. Because people reveal their true character when they think you have nothing to offer them. He laughed nervously back then. Neither of us realized how important those words would become. Over the next several weeks, I transferred enormous amounts of money behind the scenes. Venue deposits, catering balances, photography upgrades, even the honeymoon villa in Italy. When Vanessa's father publicly bragged during family meetings about making sure his daughter had the wedding she deserved, I stayed silent while paying invoices from my phone under the table. The wedding planner knew the truth because my name was on the wire transfers, but she respected my privacy. Sometimes she'd look at me with pity whenever Vanessa spoke dismissively to Helen. I could tell she knew exactly what was happening. The worst part wasn't even the insults themselves. It was watching Helen slowly convince herself she deserved them. One evening, she came into my office carrying 2 dresses. "Which one looks less embarrassing?" she asked quietly. That word again. Embarrassing. I hated that Vanessa had planted it into her mind. Helen spent 35 years raising a son with kindness, loyalty, and sacrifice, yet suddenly she felt judged because she didn't wear luxury labels or speak with fake sophistication. I took both dresses from her hands and said, "The problem isn't your clothes. The problem is that some people mistake kindness for weakness." She smiled, but I could see the hurt still sitting behind her eyes. Then came the final insult before the wedding day. Vanessa arranged a private spa outing for the important women of the wedding. Helen wasn't invited. Daniel found out accidentally and confronted Vanessa, but she brushed it off by saying, "Your mom just wouldn't fit the atmosphere." When Daniel told us, he looked genuinely upset for the first time. I expected him to defend his mother harder. Instead, he kept trying to keep peace between everyone. That disappointed me more than anything. A son should never allow his mother to be humiliated for the sake of avoiding conflict. Helen still protected him, though. "He's under stress," she whispered after he left. Don't blame him. But I did blame him. Because every moment he stayed silent, Vanessa became bolder. The morning before the wedding, I received a call from the venue manager about an unpaid final balance. Nearly $80,000. Apparently, Vanessa's father promised to handle it personally, but delayed payment again. The manager sounded nervous because the wedding was less than 24 hours away. Without hesitation, I paid the balance immediately. Another wire transfer. Another secret. Another moment where I protected people who barely respected us. That evening, while Helen carefully steamed her wedding outfit in our hotel room, she suddenly asked me something that caught me off guard. "Do you think Vanessa is ashamed of me?" I looked at my wife, this incredible woman who had carried our family through every hardship imaginable, and felt anger rise in my chest stronger than ever before. But I answered calmly, "No, she's intimidated by you." Helen laughed softly like the idea sounded ridiculous, but I meant every word. Because deep down, people like Vanessa often hate people like Helen for one reason: authenticity. Helen never pretended to be someone else. She didn't need status to feel important, and insecure people can't stand that. I should have known the wedding day itself would become a disaster, because humiliation was exactly what Vanessa had planned. The wedding morning started beautifully, at least on the surface. Napa Valley looked like something out of a movie. Sunlight poured across the vineyards. The fountain sparkled, and workers rushed around placing thousands of white roses exactly where Vanessa wanted them. Everywhere I looked, money was being burned by the minute. My money. Yet nobody knew it except Daniel and the wedding planner. Helen stood beside the hotel window, quietly fixing her earrings while soft music played in the background. She looked nervous, but she also looked proud. Proud that her son was getting married. Proud that after all the tension, maybe everyone could finally enjoy the day peacefully. I kissed her forehead before we left the room and told her she looked stunning. And she did. Her dress was elegant, simple, and graceful in a way no designer gown could ever imitate. The problem started almost immediately after we arrived at the venue. One of Vanessa's bridesmaids approached Helen with an uncomfortable smile and said, "Oh, Mrs. Carter, Vanessa asked if maybe you could wait in the family lounge until the professional photos are done." Helen blinked in confusion. "Family photos?" she asked. The bridesmaid hesitated. "No, just the main photos. The aesthetic shots." Aesthetic shots. Like my wife was some object that didn't match the decoration. I stepped forward instantly, but Helen gently touched my arm, silently begging me not to cause a scene. So she smiled politely and walked toward a lounge while younger women in expensive dresses took pictures laughing beneath flower arches my money had paid for. I watched from a distance as Vanessa posed dramatically for cameras. Everything about her was carefully curated, every smile rehearsed, every movement calculated. She cared more about social media photos than actual family. Her mother walked around barking orders at staff members, while Vanessa's father bragged loudly to guests about how our family spared no expense for this event. I nearly laughed hearing that sentence. The arrogance was unbelievable. Meanwhile, the actual people funding the wedding were being treated like unwanted guests. About an hour before the ceremony, I went looking for Helen and found her alone in the lounge, sipping water quietly. She immediately pretended everything was fine the moment she saw me. "The flowers are beautiful," she said with a forced smile. That broke my heart even more, because she was still trying to appreciate the wedding despite how she was being treated. Before I could respond, two venue coordinators walked into the room carrying seating charts. They stopped abruptly when they noticed us. One whispered something to the other, clearly not realizing I could hear them. "That's the groom's mother," she muttered quietly. I thought she'd be more polished. I saw Helen hear it too. She looked down instantly. I wanted to explode. But the real humiliation came minutes later. As guests started arriving, Vanessa pulled Daniel aside near the entrance. They were speaking quietly, but I happened to walk close enough to hear part of the conversation. Vanessa looked irritated. "Your mom keeps wandering into the VIP areas," she snapped. Daniel looked confused. "VIP areas?" Vanessa rolled her eyes impatiently. "The investors, business partners, my father's clients, important people. She's too loud and emotional around them." Then came the sentence that changed everything for me. "Honestly, Daniel, she's embarrassing." Embarrassing. That word again. Only this time, Helen heard it too. She had walked up behind them carrying a small gift box for Vanessa and froze completely when those words left her daughter-in-law's mouth. The silence afterward felt suffocating. Daniel turned pale the moment he saw his mother standing there. Vanessa's expression changed instantly from irritation to fake sweetness. "Oh my God, Helen, I didn't mean it like that," she said quickly. But everyone knew exactly what she meant. My wife stood there for a few seconds, trying not to cry in front of dozens of guests walking past. Then she quietly handed Vanessa the gift box and whispered, "I'm sorry if I caused any problems." Problems? She was apologizing for existing at her own son's wedding. That was the moment something inside me finally snapped. I watched Helen walk away toward the garden alone, shoulders trembling as she tried holding herself together. Daniel started following her, but Vanessa grabbed his arm and hissed, "Not now. The ceremony starts in 20 minutes. And unbelievably, he stayed. He stayed. I looked around the extravagant decorations, the luxury cars, the champagne towers, the orchestra preparing to play. All of it funded by the very woman they had just humiliated. My chest burned with anger, so intense I could barely think clearly anymore. The wedding planner approached me quietly then, probably sensing disaster coming. "Sir," she whispered carefully, "is everything all right?" I looked her directly in the eyes and asked one simple question. "If I asked you to stop this wedding right now, could you?" Her face went white, because unlike everyone else there, she knew exactly who had paid for everything. Continued carefully. She said Helen's personality made her uncomfortable because she acts too emotional and too involved. Emotional, involved. Imagine criticizing a mother for loving her son too much. I walked outside afterward, needing air, before I exploded. The vineyard looked perfect. Guests smiled. Servers carried trays of champagne. String musicians played softly under the California sun. From a distance, it looked like a dream wedding. But underneath all the luxury and elegance was something ugly. Arrogance, disrespect, and cruelty disguised as sophistication. And the worst part was watching my son slowly bend under it all. Daniel used to be warm-hearted, protective, loyal. But around Vanessa, he acted nervous all the time, constantly trying to avoid upsetting her. I began wondering whether he even recognized himself anymore. I finally found Helen sitting alone near the edge of the vineyard overlooking the hills. Her makeup was slightly smudged from crying, though she clearly tried fixing it before anyone noticed. She smiled weakly when I sat beside her. "I don't want to ruin Daniel's day," she whispered immediately, almost like she was rehearsing the sentence. "You didn't ruin anything," I said firmly, but she kept staring down at her hands. "Maybe Vanessa's right," she murmured softly. "Maybe I embarrass him." Hearing my wife say that nearly destroyed me. This woman spent decades sacrificing everything for our family, and now she genuinely believed she wasn't good enough to stand proudly at her own son's wedding. I took her hands and reminded her of everything she had done for Daniel. The nights she stayed awake, helping him study. The years she worked exhausting hospital shifts. The vacations she gave up so he could attend a better university. The moment she protected him from every hardship she possibly could. Helen started crying harder then. Not dramatic crying, the quiet kind that comes from deep emotional exhaustion. "I just wanted his wife to like me," she admitted. That sentence crushed me more than all of Vanessa's insults combined. Then my phone rang. It was Daniel. I answered immediately, expecting him to apologize for what happened earlier. Instead, his voice sounded panicked. "Dad, where are you?" "The ceremony starts in 10 minutes. I looked across the vineyard toward the massive floral altar his mother had secretly paid for. "With your mother," I replied coldly. There was a pause before he spoke again. "Dad, please don't make this worse today." Worse. That single word changed everything. Not, "Please comfort Mom." Not, "Vanessa was wrong." Not, "I'm sorry." Just don't make things worse. I finally realized Daniel was more worried about protecting the wedding than protecting his mother. And at that exact moment, I made a decision. I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. If Vanessa wanted to humiliate my wife publicly, then the truth would also be revealed publicly. By the time the ceremony started, I had already made up my mind. I just hadn't decided exactly how far I was willing to go. The guests took their seats beneath a massive white floral canopy, while golden sunlight spread across the vineyard hills behind them. Everything looked flawless. The kind of wedding people post online with captions about fairy tales and perfect love. But I sat there beside Helen, knowing the entire atmosphere was built on lies. My wife kept her posture graceful, despite the pain written all over her face. She still smiled politely at guests, still thanked servers, still tried protecting Daniel from embarrassment even after everything that had happened. That's who Helen was. And honestly, seeing her remain kind while being humiliated only made me angrier. Then the music started. Daniel walked to the altar looking tense but excited. A few moments later, Vanessa appeared at the end of the aisle in a designer gown that probably cost more than most people's yearly salaries. Guests gasped. Cameras flashed. Her father proudly escorted her forward, while acting like he had personally created this entire magical event. I noticed him shaking hands with business associates in the front row moments before the ceremony started, loudly joking about how expensive daughters can be. The irony almost made me laugh out loud. As Vanessa reached the altar, she glanced briefly toward Helen. Not warmly, not respectfully, more like someone checking whether an unwanted guest was staying quiet. Helen lowered her eyes instantly. That small moment was enough to remind me exactly why I could no longer stay silent. The officiant began speaking about family, love, unity, and respect. Respect. Hearing that word during this wedding felt almost insulting. Vanessa and Daniel exchanged vows carefully written to impress the audience. They talked about loyalty, partnership, building a future together. Guests wiped away tears. The orchestra played softly in the background. And throughout the entire ceremony, I kept thinking one thing. None of these people know the truth. They didn't know Helen secretly paid for Vanessa's dream wedding dress after Vanessa's father refused to cover last-minute upgrades. They didn't know I paid the venue's emergency balance less than 24 hours earlier to prevent the wedding from being canceled. They didn't know Helen personally spent weeks helping Daniel choose honeymoon destinations because Vanessa was too busy focusing on social media sponsorship deals tied to the wedding. And they definitely didn't know the bride considered the woman funding her fairy tale embarrassing. When the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, applause exploded across the vineyard. Vanessa kissed Daniel dramatically while photographers rushed closer, capturing every perfect angle. Everyone stood cheering as they walked back down the aisle together, smiling like royalty. Everyone except me, because I wasn't clapping anymore. Helen noticed immediately. She touched my arm gently under the table, silently asking me not to do anything reckless. Even then, after all the humiliation, she was still trying to protect everyone else. I squeezed her hand and whispered, "You protected this family long enough." She looked confused by my tone, but before she could ask what I meant, the reception coordinator announced cocktail hour. That's when things got worse. Inside the reception hall, guests gathered beneath crystal chandeliers while waiters served champagne and expensive appetizers. Everywhere I looked, people complimented Vanessa's elegant vision and her family's incredible generosity. Her father soaked up every compliment proudly. At one point, I overheard him telling investors, "When my daughter wants something, I make sure she gets it." Meanwhile, Helen stood alone near the edge of the ballroom because Vanessa's bridesmaids had quietly occupied the family table seats with influencers and social media personalities. I watched my wife try pretending she didn't notice. Then came the final insult. One of Vanessa's wealthy friends approached Helen, holding a champagne glass and smiling politely. "So how do you know the bride?" she asked casually. Helen blinked in surprise. "I'm Daniel's mother." The woman's expression changed instantly with embarrassment. "Oh, I'm sorry." The ballroom slowly filled with laughter, music, and the sound of champagne glasses clinking together while guests settled into their seats for the reception dinner. A massive chandelier glowed above the dance floor, reflecting light across the expensive decorations Vanessa had spent months obsessing over. Waiters moved perfectly between tables serving gourmet dishes, while photographers captured every glamorous moment for social media. From the outside, the evening looked flawless. But at our table, Helen sat quietly staring down at her untouched plate, trying her best not to cry again. I could tell she was emotionally exhausted. Every insult throughout the day had slowly chipped away at her confidence until she no longer looked like herself. And what hurt me most was that Daniel noticed it too, yet still said nothing. The speeches began shortly after dinner was served. Vanessa's maid of honor gave a dramatic speech comparing the couple to royalty, while guests laughed and applauded on cue. Then Vanessa's father stood up holding a glass of expensive whiskey, smiling proudly as the room quieted for him. He talked endlessly about success, legacy, and how important it was to give your children the very best life possible. Several times he hinted at the enormous cost of the wedding, clearly enjoying the admiration in people's faces, as though he alone had built the entire event from the ground up. At one point, he even joked, "When Vanessa wants a dream wedding, her father delivers." Guests laughed and applauded loudly. I looked over at Helen. She lowered her eyes and forced a small smile, even though I knew hearing those words hurt her deeply. Not because she cared about credit, but because the people taking credit had spent the entire day humiliating her. My wife had quietly sacrificed so much for this wedding without expecting recognition. Yet she was being treated like an unwanted guest, while others proudly claimed ownership of her generosity. Then Daniel stood up for his speech. For a moment, I honestly hoped he would finally say something meaningful about his mother. I hoped he would look at Helen and publicly thank her for the lifetime of sacrifices she made for him. I hoped he would defend her after everything that happened. Instead, he gave a safe speech filled with jokes about marriage and compliments toward Vanessa's family for welcoming him into their world. Their world. Not once did he mention the woman who spent decades building his world from nothing. I saw Helen's smile finally break. She quickly looked away, pretending to fix her napkin, but I saw the tears forming in her eyes. That was the final moment for me. Something inside my chest hardened completely. I realized if I stayed silent any longer, I would be helping them humiliate her too. As applause filled the ballroom, I slowly stood from my chair. At first, nobody paid much attention. Guests assumed I was simply heading toward the restroom or speaking with staff. But then I walked directly toward the stage where the microphone rested beside the wedding band. Rachel, the wedding planner, noticed immediately. Her eyes widened slightly because she understood before anyone else what was about to happen. Vanessa noticed me approaching, and her smile faded instantly. "Dad," Daniel said nervously into microphone, reached the stage calmly, smiled politely at the band leader, and gently took the microphone into my hand. The ballroom became quiet almost immediately. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me as soft confusion spread across the room. Vanessa looked uncomfortable already, while her father leaned back in his chair, expecting another harmless family toast. I looked directly at my wife first. Helen shook her head slightly, silently begging me not to do this. But I couldn't stay quiet anymore. Not after watching the woman I loved get treated like she was beneath everyone in that room. I cleared my throat slowly before speaking. I wasn't planning to give a speech tonight. I began calmly, but after everything I witnessed today, I think there are a few things people deserve to know. The room became completely silent. Vanessa shifted nervously in her seat, while Daniel's face turned pale almost instantly. I continued speaking carefully, keeping my voice calm despite the anger burning inside me. First, I like to talk about my wife. I turned toward Helen again. This woman spent her entire life sacrificing for her family. She worked exhausting hospital shifts, gave up vacations, sold family jewelry, and stood beside me through every difficult year imaginable so our son could have opportunities we never had growing up. Guests listened quietly now, no longer smiling. Everything Daniel became in life happened because his mother loved him unconditionally. Helen covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Then I slowly turned toward Vanessa and her family. And yet today, I said firmly, I watched this incredible woman get treated as if she were embarrassing. You could feel the tension explode across the ballroom instantly. Guests exchanged shocked looks while Vanessa's expression froze completely. Daniel looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. But I wasn't finished. Some people here seemed very proud of paying for this wedding. I continued. So I think it's only fair everyone knows the truth. Vanessa's father straightened in his chair immediately. I reached into my jacket pocket calmly and pulled out several folded payment documents Rachel had quietly printed for me earlier. The venue. I lifted one paper slightly. Paid by me. Another paper. The catering upgrades. Paid by me. Another. The honeymoon villa in Italy. Paid by me. The ballroom fell completely silent, except for distant music from outside the hall. The emergency $80,000 balance that saved this wedding yesterday morning, I looked directly at Vanessa's father. Also paid by me. The man's face lost all color instantly. Gasps spread across the room as guests looked between me and Vanessa's family in disbelief. Vanessa herself looked horrified, not because of the money, but because the image she spent months building was collapsing in front of everyone. And then I delivered the sentence that changed the entire night. "The woman you called embarrassing today," I said while looking directly at Vanessa, "is the reason this wedding even happened." For several seconds after I finished speaking, nobody moved. The ballroom felt frozen in place, as though the entire wedding had suddenly stopped breathing. Guests stared at me in complete shock, while the orchestra near the stage quietly lowered their instruments, unsure whether they were supposed to continue playing or disappear entirely. Vanessa sat motionless beside Daniel, her face drained of color, while her father looked like someone had publicly slapped him across the face. Every ounce of confidence he carried earlier had vanished, and at the center of it all sat my wife Helen, trembling quietly in her chair as tears rolled down her cheeks. I wasn't angry anymore at that point. I was calm, completely calm, and somehow that made the room even more uncomfortable. Vanessa recovered first. She forced out a nervous laugh and stood up quickly, trying desperately to regain control of the situation before whispers spread further across the ballroom. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," she said shakily while glancing around at the guests. "Of course we appreciate everything Daniel's parents contributed." "Contributed?" I interrupted calmly. The room went silent again. I slowly unfolded another paper in my hand and looked directly at her. "Vanessa, your father promised a venue payment 3 different times and failed every single time. Rachel called me yesterday morning because the wedding was hours away from cancellation." I held up the document slightly. "That wire transfer came from my account at 9:14 a.m. Every eye in the room immediately shifted toward Vanessa's father. The man looked furious now, but not at me, at being exposed. "This is inappropriate," he snapped suddenly while standing from his chair. "A wedding reception isn't the place for financial discussions." "No," I replied firmly, "but maybe it is a place to discuss publicly humiliating the woman who quietly paid for your daughter's fairy tale." A few guests actually nodded. I noticed several people at nearby tables beginning to piece things together. The awkward comments, Helen sitting alone all evening, the way Vanessa excluded her throughout the event. Suddenly the atmosphere changed. Guests who once admired Vanessa now looked uncomfortable around her. Daniel finally stood up then. "Dad, please," he whispered, clearly panicking. "Can we not do this here?" I turned toward my son slowly. And honestly, that moment hurt more than confronting Vanessa ever did. Because even now, after everything his mother endured, he still seemed more worried about the wedding atmosphere than her pain. "Do what exactly?" I asked him quietly. "Tell the truth." Daniel opened his mouth, but couldn't answer. I could see the conflict all over his face. Embarrassment, guilt, fear, confusion. Deep down, I think he knew I was right. But he had spent so long trying to keep Vanessa happy that he no longer knew how to stand up to her. Vanessa suddenly stepped forward again, this time sounding defensive instead of nervous. "I never meant to hurt Helen," she insisted quickly. "Things were stressful. Emotions were high." "You called her embarrassing," I said flatly. She froze. "And worse," I continued, my voice still calm, "you made her believe it." Helen immediately looked down again, ashamed by the attention. Even after all this, she still wanted the humiliation to end quietly. That's what people like Vanessa never understand about women like my wife. Kindness is not weakness. Helen wasn't quiet because she lacked strength. She stayed quiet because she loved her family more than her pride. Vanessa's mother finally stood up too, clearly desperate to rescue the situation. "This has become extremely dramatic," she said coldly. "Surely mature adults can discuss these things privately." I looked directly at her. "Was humiliating my wife private?" I asked. She said nothing. The silence that followed was brutal. Then, from somewhere near the back of the ballroom, one of the older guests quietly started clapping. Just once. Then another person joined. Then another. Within seconds, scattered applause spread across the room. Not loud celebratory applause, but respectful applause. Supportive applause. People weren't clapping because of money. They were clapping because they finally understood who Helen really was and how unfairly she'd been treated all day. Helen looked completely overwhelmed. Vanessa looked devastated. And Daniel looked ashamed. I stepped down from the stage slowly after that, fully expecting the reception to collapse into chaos. But before I could return to my seat, something unexpected happened. Daniel walked directly toward his mother, not Vanessa, his mother. The entire ballroom watched silently as my son stopped in front of Helen with tears in his eyes. For a moment, he couldn't even speak. Then he knelt beside her chair and quietly said the words he should have said long before this wedding ever started. "Mom, I'm sorry." The entire ballroom remained silent as Daniel knelt beside his mother's chair with tears filling his eyes. In all my years as a father, I had never seen my son look so broken. The confident groom who had smiled through the ceremony only an hour earlier was gone, replaced by a man finally realizing the damage his silence had caused. Helen immediately reached for his face the way mothers instinctively do when their children are hurting, even though she was the one who had been humiliated all day. That's who she was. Even heartbroken, her first instinct was still love. Daniel struggled to speak at first, his voice shaking under the weight of guilt, while hundreds of guests watched quietly around us. "Mom, I should have stopped it," he whispered. "I saw things happening, and I kept telling myself it would get better. I thought if I stayed quiet, everyone would eventually get along. But I failed you." Helen started crying harder hearing those words because, deep down, that acknowledgement was all she had wanted from him. Not revenge, not public humiliation, just for her son to see her pain and stand beside her. Vanessa remained near the stage, completely frozen, looking like she no longer recognized the situation slipping out of her control. Her bridesmaids whispered nervously beside her, while guests throughout the ballroom openly stared at her family, now instead of admiring them. The carefully crafted image of elegance and perfection she spent months building had shattered in less than 10 minutes. But the real turning point came when Daniel slowly stood back up and turned toward his wife. You could feel the tension immediately spread to the room again, because everyone understood something serious was about to happen. Daniel looked at Vanessa silently for several seconds before finally speaking in a calm but painful voice. "Did you really think my mother embarrassed me?" Vanessa looked stunned by the direct question. She tried forcing a soft smile and reached for his hand, but he stepped back before she could touch him. "Daniel, please, not here," she whispered nervously, glancing at the guests surrounding them. But Daniel wasn't looking at the crowd anymore. For the first time that entire day, he looked completely focused on the truth. "You excluded her from photos," he continued quietly. "You mocked the way she dresses. You told people she didn't fit the atmosphere. And when she heard you call her embarrassing, his voice cracked slightly. You didn't even apologize properly." Vanessa's face tightened as she realized there was no easy way out anymore. "I was stressed," she said defensively. "Everything was overwhelming, and I said things badly." But Daniel shook his head slowly. "No," he replied. "Stress doesn't create cruelty. It reveals it." The room became completely silent again after that sentence because everyone knew he was right. People don't accidentally humiliate others repeatedly. Those actions come from somewhere deeper. Vanessa's father suddenly stepped forward angrily, clearly desperate to regain control before the situation became even worse. "Enough," he snapped loudly. "This entire night has turned into a circus over hurt feelings." The second he said those words, I saw several guests visibly react with disgust, because now everyone finally understood exactly where Vanessa learned her arrogance from. Daniel slowly turned toward him with disappointment written all over his face. "Hurt feelings," he repeated quietly. "My mother spent years sacrificing everything for me while all of you treated her like she was beneath you." Vanessa's father opened his mouth to argue again, but Daniel cut him off before he could speak. "And the worst part is, she still tried being kind to all of us anyway." Helen covered her face, crying softly, while several guests nearby comforted her gently. Women who barely spoke to her earlier suddenly sat beside her offering tissues and kind words after realizing how unfairly she had been treated throughout the wedding. Meanwhile, Vanessa stood completely isolated near the dance floor, no longer surrounded by admiration or attention. Even her bridesmaids looked uncomfortable standing beside her now. The atmosphere inside the ballroom had changed entirely. The expensive decorations, luxury champagne, and glamorous music no longer mattered because the truth had stripped away all the performance underneath it. Then Daniel did something nobody expected. He walked to the center of the ballroom, remove his wedding ring slowly, and place it carefully on the table beside Vanessa's untouched champagne glass. Gasps spread across the room instantly. Vanessa stared at the ring like she couldn't process what she was seeing. "Daniel," she whispered in panic. But my son looked emotionally exhausted now, like someone finally waking up after ignoring reality for too long. I spent months convincing myself that keeping peace was the same thing as protecting people, he said quietly. But all I really did was allow the person I love most to get hurt over and over again. He glanced toward Helen. And if someone can humiliate my mother this easily before marriage, he looked back at Vanessa with heartbreaking disappointment in his eyes. What happens after? The ballroom felt completely frozen as everyone waited for Vanessa to respond. But for once, she had nothing left to say. For a long moment after Daniel placed the wedding ring on the table, nobody in the ballroom even seemed to breathe. The orchestra had stopped playing completely. Waiters stood frozen beside tables holding untouched champagne bottles, and every guest stared at the center of the room, watching a marriage collapse only hours after the ceremony ended. Vanessa looked pale with shock, her entire body tense, as though she still believed this was some temporary emotional outburst Daniel would eventually calm down from. But I knew my son well enough to recognize the look on his face. This wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity. The kind that only comes after someone finally sees the truth they spent too long avoiding. "Daniel, don't do this," Vanessa whispered desperately while stepping closer to him. "You're emotional right now. Your father manipulated this entire situation." I almost laughed hearing that because even now, instead of reflecting on her own behavior, she needed someone else to blame. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No," he replied quietly. "Dad didn't manipulate anything. He just finally said out loud what everyone else was too afraid to admit." Vanessa's eyes immediately filled with tears, but they didn't look like tears of guilt. They looked like panic. The kind people cry when they realize control is slipping away from them publicly. Her mother rushed forward next, speaking in the calm, fake voice wealthy families often use when trying to hide embarrassment. "Daniel," she said carefully, "every couple faces stress during weddings. You don't throw away a marriage over misunderstandings." Daniel looked emotionally drained as he answered her. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. My mother was humiliated repeatedly, and I let it happen." Then he glanced around the ballroom at all the guests silently watching. "Honestly, I think part of me knew it was wrong from the beginning. I just kept convincing myself it would stop." His voice cracked slightly. "But people don't suddenly become kinder after marriage." Those words hit the room hard because everyone understood exactly what he meant. Vanessa finally lost control completely then. "Oh, please," she snapped bitterly, tears running down her face now. "Why is everyone acting like Helen is some innocent victim? She's overly emotional. She inserts herself into everything. And honestly, she makes people uncomfortable sometimes." The second those words left her mouth, several guests visibly recoiled in shock because instead of apologizing, she had just confirmed everything I exposed earlier. Even worse, she said it while Helen sat only a few feet away, silently crying. Daniel stared at his wife in disbelief. "You still don't understand," he said softly. Vanessa looked around desperately hoping someone would support her, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The same guests who admired her elegance earlier now looked disturbed by her cruelty. Even some of her own friends avoided eye contact. One older woman near the front quietly shook her head in disappointment before whispering something to her husband. The illusion was gone. People finally saw the truth underneath the expensive dresses and perfect photographs. Then something happened that surprised even me. Helen slowly stood up. Despite her tears and emotional exhaustion, she walked calmly toward Vanessa with more grace than anyone else in that ballroom deserved. I honestly thought she might comfort her, because that's the kind of heart my wife has. But instead, Helen stopped a few feet away and spoke softly enough that the entire silent room still heard every word. "I spent months blaming myself," she admitted quietly. "I kept thinking maybe if I dressed differently, spoke differently, or stayed quieter, you might finally accept me." Vanessa looked stunned hearing Helen speak so directly. "But today I realized something important," Helen continued gently. "Kind people shouldn't have to earn basic respect." Several guests nodded immediately, while listening. Helen wiped tears from her face before adding, "And love without kindness eventually becomes cruelty." The ballroom fell silent again after that sentence. Even Vanessa looked shaken now, because deep down she probably knew Helen was right. Daniel walked over beside his mother then, standing next to her instead of beside his wife for the first time all day. The symbolism of that moment wasn't lost on anyone. Vanessa saw it too. Her shoulders slowly dropped as reality finally settled over her face. This wasn't something she could charm her way out of anymore. The image she spent years building, the perfect, sophisticated woman marrying into a beautiful future, had collapsed in front of hundreds of people because she underestimated the quiet strength of the woman she mocked. Vanessa's father angrily grabbed his suit jacket and muttered something about this family being insane before storming toward the exit with his wife, following behind him in humiliation. Several of their business associates quietly left soon after, clearly uncomfortable staying any longer. One by one, guests began gathering their belongings while whispers spread across the ballroom about what had happened. The fairy tale reception was falling apart in real time, and strangely enough, it was the first honest moment of the entire wedding. By the end of the night, the ballroom that once looked like a luxury fairy tale felt almost empty. Half-finished champagne glasses had abandoned on tables, expensive flower arrangements drooped under dimming lights, and waiters quietly cleaned around guests who slipped out awkwardly after witnessing the collapse of marriage only hours after the ceremony. But strangely, for the first time that entire day, Helen finally looked peaceful, exhausted, emotional, overwhelmed. Yes, but peaceful too, because the truth was no longer hidden. She no longer had to sit quietly pretending cruelty didn't hurt her. Everyone had finally seen who she truly was, and more importantly, Daniel had seen it too. We left the reception long after most guests were gone. Daniel walked beside his mother through the vineyard in complete silence, while cool night air moved through the rows of grapes surrounding the property. I stayed slightly behind them for a moment, watching my son hold Helen's hand the same way he used to when he was little. It honestly broke my heart realizing how close he came to losing himself, completely trying to fit into Vanessa's world. Eventually, Daniel stopped walking and turned toward us with tears still sitting in his eyes. "I don't know how I let things get this far," he admitted quietly. Helen immediately tried comforting him, but this time he shook his head. "No, Mom, please don't protect me from this. I should have defended you the very first time she disrespected you." His voice cracked again as guilt overwhelmed him. "Instead, I kept asking you to tolerate it because I was afraid of conflict." I could hear the disappointment he felt toward himself more than anything else. That night, Daniel didn't return to the luxury honeymoon suite booked for him and Vanessa. Instead, he came back to our hotel and sat with us until nearly sunrise, talking honestly for the first time in months. He admitted there had been warning signs long before the wedding. Arguments about class, status, appearances, and even how often he should visit us after marriage. Vanessa constantly criticized ordinary people, mocked emotional vulnerability, and cared deeply about how relationships looked to outsiders instead of how they actually felt privately. Daniel confessed he ignored those signs because he convinced himself love meant compromise. But somewhere along the way, compromise turned into silence, and silence turned into betrayal toward the people who loved him most. A few days later, the story spread online after several guests posted vague details about the dramatic reception. Some versions exaggerated things wildly, but one detail remained consistent everywhere. The groom's father publicly exposed that he secretly funded the wedding after the bride insulted the groom's mother. Ironically, the same social media image Vanessa spent months carefully building became the thing that destroyed her reputation overnight. People who once admired her glamorous lifestyle suddenly criticized her arrogance and cruelty instead. Daniel later told me she tried contacting him repeatedly after the wedding, first angrily, then emotionally, then desperately. But by then, something inside him had changed permanently. Once someone finally sees the truth clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee it. As for Helen, she spent weeks afterwards struggling emotionally despite everything. Public humiliation leaves scars, even when people eventually defend you. There were nights she quietly asked me whether the entire situation was somehow her fault. That's the tragedy of kind people. They often blame themselves for cruelty of others. But slowly, something beautiful started happening. Daniel began visiting constantly, not out of guilt alone, but because he genuinely wanted to rebuild a relationship he nearly damaged forever. He started taking Helen to breakfast every Sunday morning, helping around our house without being asked, and spending hours simply talking with her again like they used to before the wedding chaos consumed everything. Little by little, I watched my wife's confidence return. About 6 months later, Daniel officially finalized the annulment. He told us signing those papers felt less like losing a marriage and more like waking up from a life that never should have happened. He also started therapy shortly afterward because he wanted to understand why he became so willing to ignore unhealthy behavior just to avoid confrontation. Honestly, hearing my son say that made me proud of him again. Growth begins the moment someone stops making excuses for themselves. One evening nearly a year after the wedding disaster, the three of us sat together on our back porch watching the sunset while Helen laughed at something Daniel said. It was one of those quiet family moments that money can't buy and status can't imitate. Daniel suddenly looked at his mother and said softly, "You know, that wedding falling apart probably saved my life." Helen smiled sadly before touching his hand. "No," she replied gently. "The truth saved your life." And sitting there beside the woman I loved, watching my son finally understand what truly matters in life, I realized something important too. Respect means nothing when it's based on money, appearances, or social status. Real respect is how you treat the people who love you when they have nothing to offer except their heart.